Okay, folks, one more to go. Last but not least, please join me in welcoming Derek Reed. I want to tell you guys a story. It was February 1836, and the Texas Revolutionary Army was an absolute mess. The provisional government that had been set up to run the Revolutionary War against Mexico was absolutely broke. They could hardly find any recruits, and the few recruits that they could find, they could hardly afford to feed them. And there were 4 main generals in the Texas Army, and each of those generals was claiming to have been given control of the entire Texas Army. And so this was a disaster any way you slice it. And during this time, there was a young lieutenant in the cavalry named William Barrett Travis. He was 26 years old, he was a former attorney, and on February 3rd, he was sent with 30 men to reinforce a small fort outside the town of San Antonio. You know that fort today as the Alamo. Now, when you hear the Alamo, usually these grand, heroic images pop into your mind. But back in 1836, the Alamo was a crapshoot. It was this old Spanish mission that had been kind of hastily retrofitted into a fort. But that fort really wasn't useful for repelling anything larger than the random attack by Native American tribes. Actually, General Santa Anna of the Mexican Army called the Alamo an irregular fortification hardly worthy of the name. And like everything else to do with the Texan military cause, the Alamo was completely underfunded and undermanned. Colonel James C. Neal, who was the commander at the Alamo, said, "If there's ever been $1 in this place, I have no knowledge of it." And Travis's reinforcements that he brought the grand total of soldiers at the fort to about 180. This wasn't exactly Fort Knox. And so about a week after Travis arrived, Neal left to go search for more reinforcements and supplies. And Travis, who happened to be the next highest ranking officer in the fort, was left in control. But the problem was, of the soldiers in the fort, only about half of them were associated with the official Texas Army. The other half were these volunteers who had been gathered up from different parts in the U.S. and who had come to Texas to hopefully win some land and maybe some spoils in the war. And these volunteers, they didn't like Travis. They actually voted in another commander of their own. And this was James Bowie, who was this grisly adventureman who had a reputation for fighting off Indians with a 2-foot-long knife. That's pretty badass. And Bowie agreed to become co-commanders with Travis. And so I want you to picture this. You have this fort that's basically falling apart on its own. It doesn't have any money. It has very few men at it. And of the soldiers stationed at that fort, half of them are loyal to one leader, and half of them are loyal to another. Now, I'm not a business major, but this does not sound like a healthy corporate structure. And to make matters worse, at this time, the main force of Mexico's army was marching toward the Alamo under the command of General Santa Anna, who also happened to be Mexico's dictator at the time. And so, Santa Anna and his army arrived on February 23rd, much to the surprise of the Texans. They had no idea he was coming, and they had made no preparations for a siege. And so, later that day, when the Mexicans raised a blood-red flag signifying that they would take no prisoners, the Texans responded by firing the Alamo's largest cannon at them, and the Battle of the Alamo began. Santa Anna cut off the Texans' lines for reinforcements and set up cannons to start bombarding the fort. And really, from the very beginning, it was not going well for the Texans. On the second day of the battle, James Bowie, that co-commander, collapsed of illness and was unable to fight. And so once again, sole control of the Alamo fell back into Travis's lap. And Travis knew at that point that the fort was doomed unless they could get reinforcements. And so he wrote a letter to the Texas government. "Fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. The enemy has demanded a surrender. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. I call on you, in the name of liberty, the American character, and everything dear to patriotism, to come to our aid with all dispatch. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible, and die like a soldier, who never forgets what is due to his own self and to the image of his country. Victory or death. William Barrett Travis. Travis sent this letter off and the fight raged on. And the Texans, because they were so undersupplied, really had to improvise when they were fighting back. They ran out of cannonballs, and so they loaded up their cannons with any spare metal they could find. Doorknobs, nails, even forks. And they held off the Mexicans like this for about a week and a half, much longer than anyone would have expected them to last. But it soon became clear that their cause was hopeless. Reinforcements didn't come, and on March 3rd, the Texans watched as 1,500 fresh Mexican soldiers marched into San Antonio. Later that day, Travis received word that Santa Anna was preparing his final all-out assault on the Alamo. And so, he gathered his men in the yard of the Alamo. Travis was honest with them. He told them that the Mexicans would soon overrun the fort and take it, and that any Texan found there would be put to death. Having said that, Travis drew his sword and drew a line in the sand. Travis said, "As for me, I'm going to stay here. You're free to leave, but if you're with me, step across this line." All but one of the Texans crossed that line, and nobody remembers that one guy. And the next day, it happened just as Travis said. The Mexicans attacked at dawn, overran the fort in about 2 hours, and killed all of the Texans there. But that's not the end of the story. Santa Anna called the Battle of the Alamo a small affair. He figured that after that great show of might by the Mexican army, anybody would be a fool to join up with the Texan cause. But he was wrong. Word of that battle spread around Texas, and so did Travis's letter. And Texans, hearing the news, wanted revenge. Volunteers flocked to the Texas Army. And about a month and a half after the Battle of the Alamo ended, the Texan Army ambushed Santa Anna and his troops while they were sleeping in their tents one morning. That fight lasted 18 minutes. Santa Anna was captured, and the Texans won the battle and the war. And while those Texan troops were storming the camps, there were 3 words that they all kept yelling. Remember the Alamo. Now, I'm sure you guys are probably all thinking the same thing. Derek, it's a wonderful story. But what the heck does this have to do with business comm or leader of interest? And well, my state pride is more than enough reason for me to want to talk about this. I do think we can learn something from William Barrett Travis's story. Because Travis, he wasn't a perfect, comprehensive leader who had everything down and got everything right. In fact, very little is known about his life, and after all, he lost the battle that he commanded. He registers as little more than a blip on the radar screen of history. But, so Travis wasn't a level 5 leader, but what he was a young man who was dropped into a leadership position where he was way out, way in over his head. Instead of backing down, Travis stuck to his post, and something good happened as a result. And I think we should pay special attention to this as King students, because when we all graduate here in a year, 2 or 3, chances are we're not going to be stepping into some Fortune 500 company where everything's running smoothly, where we have all the resources and money we need. Chances are we will be stepping into the Alamo. We'll be undersupplied and undermanned in some crappy old building, and while the Mexican army might not be marching for us, I do hear those IRS agents fearsome. And so, when we find ourselves in this situation, we'll have a choice. We can throw up our hands and say, this is just too much. Or, like Travis, when all of the odds are against us, we can draw a line in the sand and say, victory or death. As for me, I'm with Travis. Thank you.